As part of this lesson's exercise, I'm asking you to finish up working through the textual variants that I've listed there in Colossians 1 to 2, chapter 1, verse 2. And so you're building on the work that you've already been doing. And so the first thing I'm asking you to do is to use the textual criticism worksheet, and that's what you see here on the right. And I've posted a link to that, the documents in your syllabus and course documents folder. And I want you to work through each element of the rational eclectic method, evaluating external evidence and evaluating internal evidence. And for more detail on these categories, I asked you to read the Canons of Textual Criticism. And this is a link to a website. And the reason why I'm using websites is just to try to reduce the amount of material that you have to buy. There are books available out there, but all I'm trying to do in this section is just introduce you to the discipline of textual criticism, so you'll have some basic knowledge of how the process works, and you can do some evaluations on your own, and you could explain this to a congregation if you needed to. So you take the variants here, Colossians 1 verse 2, and just work through each element of the process. Now, don't worry about trying to be exhaustive. This is a very technical, professional field, so I'm not expecting you to be an expert. I'm certainly not an expert. I just want you to be familiar with how this works. So work through each element of the worksheet using the data that you've been providing here. And then I want you to express your opinion of what you think, based on your evaluation of the external evidence and the internal evidence, which of these readings do you think is best supported by the evidence? And then what I'd like for you to do, I want you to read this statement from Metzger's textual commentary. In the UBS edition of the Greek New Testament, there is a commentary provided that you can purchase that goes through each textual variant and gives some explanation of why the committee chose that particular reading in the UBS text. And what I want you to do here is I want you to read through Metzger's commentary on this variant. And then I want you to identify which internal category and which specific principle within that category informed this decision from the committee. So all I want you to be able to do is read his statement, and then I want you to be able to identify what the decisive category was for the committee. And all I'm trying to see here is, are you aware of the types of issues that you're dealing with when it comes to internal and external evidence, and can you identify the reasoning when you see it? Again, I'm not asking you to spend hours and hours and hours on this. I just want you to have a good survey understanding of the process. Okay, now what I want to do is I'm going to pick up with my variant study in Matthew 6:13. And I'm just going to very briefly walk you through the process with this particular variant. So I've got on the right-hand side, I've got my textual criticism worksheet. On my left-hand side, I've got my data. And as you recall, I've asked you to use the textual criticism guide. So you'll combine the textual criticism guide, the worksheet, the website that I directed you to that will give you some more context for that. But starting off, the date. The preference should be given to the reading having the earliest attestation. So we're working on external evidence. And remember, by external evidence, what we're talking about here is not what the document says, but the quality of the document, the writing material, the date of the document, when it was copied, where it was copied, and how it relates to other documents. So now we're talking about external evidence. So let's start with date. And what I want to do, I'm not going to go through every manuscript. I'm going to look at my data over here. The way I've classified the witnesses, what the witnesses are, and I want to identify the dates of some of these manuscripts to get some kind of idea, at least in terms of date, which of these readings has the earliest attestation. Now, I have the electronic version of the apparatus. Here at the bottom, you see, here at the top, you see I've got the UBS5 text on the left, the Textus Receptus on the right that includes the lengthy variant complex right here. And at the bottom, I've got my textual evidence, the apparatus. Now, the beauty of Accordance and other electronic databases is when I want to find out, okay, what is the date of this manuscript Sinaiticus? Well, I can just hover over it and it provides me with where it is. It's in London, and you see that Roman numeral 4 at the bottom down here. Roman numeral 4, 4th century. Now, if you don't have the electronic database, you do have your UBS5, you do have the introductory material, and so that's here. In the introduction to the UBS5, under the category of introduction, the Greek manuscripts, the presentation of the manuscripts, you can look them up here in the introduction. So you see Sinaiticus here, where it's located. It's in London. This is the how you describe it, Sinaiticus, and then there's the date, 4th century roundabout. So either way, you can access the dating for the manuscripts. And so let's go back and just do some surveys. So here in the Alexandrian category, we've got a 4th century manuscript of Vaticanus. We've got another 4th. And let's see, with Codex Beza, we've got a 5th century. And I'm just working through some of these here. What about the Coptic? Let's see. And this is the Coptic, part of the Coptic Bohairic, so that's this one here. I don't have a date on that, so that's not that helpful. So far for the printed text, I've got Sinaiticus, 4th century, Vaticanus, 4th century. What about D, Codex Beza, 5th century? How about there's the Codex Z, that's the 6th century. So we've got some 4th, 5th, and 6th century dates for the printed text. What about this variant here, variant 1, where it just says Panaru Amen? We've got this Monuscule 17. So I'm going to look that up down here, number 17. I couldn't find a date for 17. That's interesting. It's not in the introduction or anything, so that's not very helpful. But Jerome, 419 to 420, so 5th century. But I went up and I looked up Origen over here in the for the printed text. Origen is old. Origen 253 to 254. So this is mid 3rd century. So far, the printed text has the oldest. What about, this is the Textus Receptus over here, variant 2. What about some of these? Let's look at, let's take a look at L. L, 8th century. What about Monuscule 33, 9th century, Monuscule 892. 9th century. So these codexes are younger by several centuries. So that's not in the favor of the Textus Receptus at that point. What about, let's see, W. Let's just look at that one and see what we get here. 4th and 5th century. Well, that's pretty early. Delta, 9th century. Theta, 9th century. So we have a little bit of early here with W, but I'd say based on just this quick survey so far on date, the printed text is older. How about this extended variant? Let's look at 157. See if we can find a date for that one. 1122, so 12th century. 1253, we have a date for that one. I mean, based on just the minimum, there's only 2 available manuscripts, and one of them doesn't actually attest to the whole thing. We can pretty much rule out this extended one right off the bat, I would say. So based on a very quick survey of the date, I would go with the printed text. Now the next external evidence is geographical distribution, and this is very vague because it is difficult to determine where exactly these manuscripts were copied. Even if they were found somewhere, that doesn't mean they were copied there. So this is finely nuanced, and so don't try to spend a whole lot of time on this, but basically geographic, and I've given you an extra note here, geographical location of manuscripts is related to text type. So Alexandrian in Egypt, or the Western texts, and you can see here Italian, Old Italian versions. Byzantine, the eastern part of the empire, and then if you have some church fathers or some of the versions, then this can help you evaluate a little bit more specifically geographical distribution. So based simply on text type, Alexandrian, Western, Unclassified, and Byzantine, this variant 3 is not well attested at all. Neither is variant 1, only in the classified area. When you think Jerome, think Latin and in the West. But for both the printed text and the Textus Receptus, you've got Alexandrian and Coptic, so you've got Egyptian attestation. You've got Old Italian, so you've got examples in the West. You've got examples in the East, the Byzantine Empire and Jerusalem here. So geographically, there's nothing decisive here. Both the printed text and the Textus Receptus variants are spread throughout. So nothing decisive there. Textual relationships. You have very few for variant 1, very few for variant 3, and they're in the unclassified category. So I think at this point I would definitely rule out further evaluation on variant 1 and variant 3. But with textual relationships, you do have examples in both of our primary, the printed and the Textus Receptus. Both of these have Alexandrian, Western, Unclassified, and Byzantine. As far as Alexandrian is concerned, the interesting thing here is that the printed text has the earlier examples. And even here, this Coptic tradition, you see there's an omission there. That tells you that somewhere in the tradition of the Alexandrian examples of the Textus Receptus, that there's some confusion, there's some complexity there. So in terms of textual relationships, geographical distribution, and date, at this point I'm definitely favoring the printed text on the basis of external evidence. So next would be internal evidence, and this is a little bit more finely nuanced, starting with transcriptional probabilities. That is, what scribes likely did when copying the New Testament. Now, I'm dependent on you having done your reading at this point to get a feel for these categories, but the preferred reading, just on internal evidence, is the shorter reading. Scribes were more likely, if they came across manuscripts that differed, they were more likely to include differences than they were to, you could say, delete words. So the shorter reading is preferred. Which is shorter? The printed text or the Textus Receptus? Well, that's pretty obvious, and so we'll go at shorter or longer reading, we'll go with the printed text. Reading different from the parallel. I can't really think of a parallel Lord's Prayer. Maybe in Luke you have some examples of some prayer reports, but this form, there's no real parallel, so that's not very helpful. Number three, more difficult reading. Neither one of these, neither the printed text nor the Textus Receptus here, neither one provides any kind of theological difficulty or grammatical difficulty or anything like that. The reading which best explains the origins of the others, I think for me, this kind of blends into intrinsic probabilities in a way, and that is if you have Jesus praying, then especially, for example, in the Byzantine tradition and in the lectionary tradition, where do the lectionaries occur here? Yeah, the lectionary tradition. Basically, lectionaries were portions of text that you would use in church. In the lectionary tradition, you would be compelled as a part of your preaching, if you were reading this text, to conclude it with an amen. So in a way, I think that this abrupt ending to a prayer that we have in the printed text would naturally give rise to and help explain why you would want at least this addition of an amen at the end. So maybe it's weak, but I think that the reading that best explains the origin of the others would be the printed text. It's very difficult for me to imagine that if this is the original reading, that you would have a lot of rationale for deleting that entire part, especially as early as these best representations, origin 3rd century, and well attested throughout all the categories and including the earliest manuscripts. There's no rational reason in my mind for deleting this. Therefore, it makes more sense that, based on internal evidence, that this is an addition. So, let's wrap it up. What does the evidence, both the external and the internal evidence, favor? Taking it all together, you have earlier representation in the Alexandrian, which is the more supposedly the more reliable classification. It is well attested throughout geographically, and what else have we got? The textual relationships I've already mentioned favors the printed text, and I do think that the internal evidence makes more sense if the printed text is original as opposed to this expansion. So why the expansion? Liturgy. This became a part of the church's worship, especially in the lectionaries, and it just makes sense theologically to expand on that concluding prayer report. And you can see here even the addition of the Trinitarian formula, the power and the glory of the Father, the Son, the Spirit. So even here you see further expansion. So I would argue that the printed text is original. Now, I want to raise this practical point before we conclude this. So you have somebody sitting in your church and they're reading out the King James Version and they have this, and they might be disturbed if you were to say to them, well, because yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, amen, this is not a part of the original text. And they might be, of course, confused and disturbed at the theological implications. But I would say, even if you delete this, can we find other places in the Bible that affirm that the Father is the sovereign king over the kingdom and that all power and glory belongs to him? Well, of course. So even if you lose this expansion statement, you've not lost anything theologically from the New Testament. These doctrines are affirmed everywhere. So you haven't lost anything essential to the faith if you lose that expansion statement. And that's important. Because let's face it, the idea of someone having their cherished Bible, the King James, the New King James, and then you come along and say, "Oh, this part of the verse isn't part of the Bible." Well, that can be very disturbing. And what I would try to allay those fears with is to say, even if it's not included, that doesn't mean you've lost these truths from the Bible. And I think that's a very important practical consideration. So obviously we haven't done an exhaustive study of every manuscript and all the details involved, but hopefully just by walking through this process a little bit, you get some kind of feel for the academic study of this, and it'll help you understand how and why some of these decisions have been made by modern editorial committees. And you can explain this to a congregation when you get to a difficult text like this. So I hope that's helpful.